January 26, 1942. 3 p.m., Whitehall, London. Winston Churchill stands at a rain-streaked window on the second floor of the Admiralty building. His hands are clasped behind his back. His cigar has gone cold in the ashtray. Below, the sound reaches him first. Not the thunder of British boots he's heard for 2.5 years, but something different. A heavier rhythm, rougher cadence, American voices calling orders in accents from Texas and Brooklyn and Iowa. He leans forward and watches the first column of United States Army troops march past in their olive-drab uniforms. For the first time since May 1940, Britain is not alone. The moment carries weight that goes beyond ceremony. 20 months earlier, Churchill stood in the cabinet war rooms beneath these same streets, watching France collapse, watching the last British soldiers evacuate from Dunkirk, watching the Luftwaffe gather across the Channel for an invasion that seemed inevitable. He had made his famous promise to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and streets. But promises don't stop panzers. And for 20 months, Britain has fought almost entirely alone. The men marching below Churchill's window are from the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division, activated just 14 months ago at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Most of them have never been outside the United States before December. Most of them have never heard a shot fired in anger. They march in formation past buildings still showing blast damage from the Blitz, past rubble piles and where homes stood 18 months ago, past Londoners who stop on the sidewalk to watch in silence. Churchill turns from the window. His private secretary, John Martin, stands near the door. The Prime Minister's eyes are wet. Not from age, not from fatigue, but from something Martin has rarely seen in 30 months of war. Relief. Churchill reaches for his cigar, finds it dead, sets it down again. "They're here," he says quietly. Just that. They're here. But the story of this moment begins 7 weeks earlier and 4,000 miles west. On December 7th, 1941, 1:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The White House, Washington. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has just received the first fragmentary reports from Hawaii. Japanese carrier aircraft have attacked the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Details are still coming in, but the word catastrophic appears in 3 separate cables. Roosevelt sits at his desk in the Oval Study, his face gray. He lights a Camel cigarette with hands that shake slightly. Press Secretary Steve Early is already drafting the statement that will go out within the hour. But Roosevelt is not thinking about statements. He's thinking about a promise he made to Winston Churchill 3 months ago at Placentia Bay. When this comes, Roosevelt had said aboard HMS Prince of Wales in August, "We will be with you." Churchill had pressed him. When? How many divisions? How soon? Roosevelt had been maddeningly vague, constrained by an American public that still wanted no part of Europe's war. "The time will come," he'd said. "Now the time has come." But not in the way either man expected. Churchill receives the news at Chequers, his country retreat, at approximately 10 p.m. London time. He is dining with American envoy Averell Harriman and British ambassador to Washington Lord Halifax, recently returned. His valet, Frank Sawyers, brings in a small radio. The BBC broadcast is terse. Pearl Harbor attacked, heavy casualties, extent unknown. Churchill stops mid-sentence. He looks at Harriman. "We are all in the same boat now," he says. But what he means is something deeper, something he has waited 2.5 years to say. America will fight. He goes to bed that night with a certainty he has not felt since 1939. Hitler has made his greatest mistake. The Wehrmacht can defeat France, yes. It can savage Yugoslavia, Greece, Crete. It can drive deep into Soviet Russia. but it cannot defeat the combined industrial might of Britain, Soviet Russia, and the United States simultaneously. Churchill will later write in his memoirs, "I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." For 30 months, he has carried the weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders alone. That weight is about to be shared. But knowing America is in the war and seeing American soldiers on British soil are two different things. The first American troops begin arriving in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942, exactly 7 weeks after Pearl Harbor. They are men of the 34th Infantry Division and supporting units, approximately 4,000 soldiers in the first wave. They disembark at Belfast and Dufferin Quay from converted troop ships, carrying M1903 Springfield rifles and full packs, moving down gangways in columns of twos. Most of them are draftees, pulled from civilian life in the past 18 months under the Selective Training and Service Act. They are farmers and factory workers and shop clerks, 18 to 25 years old, trained at bases in Louisiana and California and Tennessee. The people of Belfast watch from the docks. The reception is muted, not hostile, but reserved. Britain has been bombed, blockaded, and bled for 30 months. They have heard promises before. Chamberlain promised peace for our time in 1938. France promised the Maginot Line was impregnable. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Words are cheap. The British want to see action, but action takes time. The 34th Division is not ready for combat. They need more training, more equipment, integration with British command structures. What they can do immediately, however, is show the flag. And so, 2 weeks after their arrival, advance elements are transported to London for a ceremonial march through the city. A calculated morale operation, approved by General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of U.S. forces in the European theater, and by the British War Office. It is propaganda, yes, but propaganda that serves truth. America is here. Churchill is not officially scheduled to attend. He has a war cabinet meeting at 4 p.m., a speech to prepare for Commons, cables from Moscow demanding more Arctic convoys. But John Martin quietly arranges for the Prime Minister to be in the Admiralty building at 3 p.m. with a clear view of Whitehall. And Churchill, understanding what Martin has done, says nothing. He simply appears at the window at 2:55, cigar in hand, and waits. The column forms up at Hyde Park Corner at 2:30 p.m. Major John Downing, commanding the lead battalion, rides a jeep at the front. Behind him, 400 infantrymen in clean uniforms and polished boots march in 12-man ranks. They have been rehearsing this for 3 days, not combat drills, but parade drill, perfecting the cadence and alignment. The route will take them down Piccadilly, through Trafalgar Square, and down Whitehall past the Cenotaph and the government buildings. It is 3 miles, 45 minutes at march speed. The weather is miserable. January in London means cold rain, grey skies, temperatures hovering just above freezing. The soldiers march anyway. Major Downing gives the order, and 400 American boots hit cobblestones in unison. The sound echoes off the buildings lining Piccadilly. People begin to emerge from shops and pubs, drawn by the unfamiliar rhythm. A woman in a threadbare coat stands at a corner, watching. She's perhaps 35 years old enough to remember the Great War, young enough to have a husband in North Africa with the 8th Army. She does not cheer, but she watches, and that is enough. The column moves through Trafalgar Square. Nelson's column rises above them, a monument to Britain's last great existential war against a continental tyrant. That war took 23 years and 6 coalitions to win. This war is in its 3rd year, and the coalitions are only now forming. The Americans pass under Nelson's gaze. and the symbolism is not lost on the Londoners who watch. Admiral Lord Nelson defeated Napoleon's fleet with British oak and British guns, but he did not fight alone. He fought as part of a coalition. Now, 136 years later, another coalition is forming against another tyrant. They turn onto Whitehall. Churchill sees them from 300 feet away. The column emerges into view at the north end of Whitehall, moving south toward Parliament. He can see the stars and stripes carried by the colour guard, rippling in the cold wind. He can see the olive-drab uniforms, darker than British khaki, the different cut of the helmets. He can hear the cadence, an American sergeant calling time, his voice carrying up through the rain. For a moment, Churchill is 77 years old instead of 67. He is remembering another war, another coalition, another time when American soldiers arrived in Europe to turn the tide. He was First Lord of the Admiralty then, in 1917, when the American Expeditionary Force landed in France. He remembers the skepticism from British and French commanders who doubted the Americans could fight. He remembers the casualties at Belleau Wood and the Argonne that proved them wrong. And he remembers the armistice that came, in part, because Germany could not match the combined industrial and military power of the Allies. History does not repeat itself, but it echoes. The column passes directly below Churchill's window now. He can see individual faces. Boys, really, some of them, barely old enough to shave. He sees a private, perhaps 19 years old, marching in the third rank. The soldier's face is set in concentration, focused on keeping step, keeping alignment. He does not look up at the windows. He does not see Winston Churchill watching him from above. But Churchill sees him, and in that young face, Churchill sees the future. The mathematics of war are brutal and simple. Britain has 46 million people. The British Empire has perhaps 450 million, but most are separated by oceans or committed to fighting Japan in Asia. Germany has 70 million people in the Reich proper, plus the resources of occupied Europe. France, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Low Countries, Norway, Denmark. The Soviet Union has nearly 200 million, but the Wehrmacht is currently besieging Leningrad and pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields. Britain cannot win alone. Churchill has known this since 1940. The question was never whether Britain could win alone. The question was whether Britain could survive long enough for help to arrive. The help is arriving now. And not just these 400 men, but the millions behind them. America has a population of 133 million and an industrial capacity that dwarfs Britain and Germany combined. America is not yet mobilized, not fully, but it is mobilizing. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh are converting to war production. Shipyards on both coasts are launching Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day. Training camps across 48 states are processing millions of draftees. The American giant, asleep since 1918, is waking up. And when it is fully awake, the outcome of this war becomes inevitable. But that is tomorrow. Today, Churchill watches 400 Americans march through London in the rain and allows himself a moment of simple, profound relief. The column continues south. They pass the cenotaph, Britain's memorial to the dead of the Great War. Major Downing, riding in the jeep, raises his hand in salute. Behind him, 400 men execute eyes right in unison, oaizu, gesture of respect for the fallen of another generation. Some of the Londoners watching from the sidewalk raise their hands in return, not saluting exactly, but acknowledging. The gesture says more than words. You are here. We see you. Welcome. They pass Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's official residence stands behind sandbags and barricades. They pass the Foreign Office, its window still covered with blast tape from the Blitz. They passed the Treasury, where civil servants work in basement offices because the upper floors are too damaged to occupy. Every building tells the story of a city that has been bombed nightly, that has survived on rations and determination, that has waited for this moment. And the Americans, marching through, begin to understand what they have entered. One of them, Private First Class Samuel Miller from Oklahoma, will later write to his parents, "We marched past buildings that were half destroyed, and people came out to watch, and nobody cheered. They just looked at us. And I realized they're wondering if we're really going to help, or if we're just here for show. And I decided right then that we were going to help. We were going to prove it." Miller will die 9 months later at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, part of the price America pays to make good on that promise. The march ends at Parliament Square. The column halts, and Major Downing dismisses the formation. The soldiers break ranks, lighting cigarettes, stamping their feet to restore circulation. Some of them notice the damage to Westminster Abbey, its windows blown out, its roof partially collapsed from a bomb that fell in May 1941. They are getting their first real look at what this war has done to Britain. And Britain is getting its first real look at the men who will help end it. Churchill leaves the window at 3:45 p.m. He has a war cabinet meeting in 15 minutes. But before he goes, he turns to John Martin and says something Martin will remember for the rest of his life. Churchill says, "Now we shall win the war, not immediately, but eventually. And when it is won, people will forget how close we came to losing it, but I will never forget." He pauses, looks back out the window one more time. "I will never forget what it felt like to stand alone, and I will never forget the moment we stopped standing alone." Martin writes it down that evening in his diary. The quote is not exact. Churchill did not speak in perfectly formed sentences, and Martin's memory may have added polish, but the substance is accurate, and the emotion is real. That evening, Churchill addresses the War Cabinet. He does not mention the march through London. He does not need to. Everyone in the room knows what it means. Instead, he focuses on practical matters: the deployment schedule for American forces, the coordination with British command, the allocation of resources. But there is a change in his tone, subtle but unmistakable. For 30 months, every meeting has carried an undercurrent of desperation, a sense of racing against time. Tonight, that undercurrent is gone, replaced by something different. Not confidence, not yet, but certainty. The war will be long. It will be brutal, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. The American presence in Britain grows rapidly. By June 1942, there are 60,000 American troops in the United Kingdom. By December, 200,000. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, there will be 1.5 million. An army larger than the entire British Expeditionary Force that crossed to France in September 1939. They will train on British ranges, fly from British airfields, load onto British ships for the invasion of North Africa, and then Sicily, and then Normandy. They will die in British hospitals and be buried in British cemeteries, and they will, slowly and at great cost, help Britain and its allies destroy the Nazi regime. But the seeds of that victory are planted here, on this grey January afternoon, when 400 American soldiers march through London in the rain. The march itself changes nothing tactically. No battles are won, no ground taken, no enemies defeated, but it changes everything strategically. Because it makes real what has been, until now, only a promise. America is in the war. America is committed. America will fight until the end. Churchill understands this. He has spent 30 months begging, cajoling, and pleading with Roosevelt to bring America into the war. He has written hundreds of cables, made dozens of speeches, sent envoys and emissaries. He has traded 50 aging American destroyers for British bases. He has opened British intelligence to American scrutiny. He has done everything short of prostrating himself. And even then, it took Pearl Harbor to force America's hand. But now, finally, it is done. The isolation is over. The partnership is formed. And standing at that window on January 26, 1942, watching American boots on British cobblestones, Churchill allows himself to believe, for the first time since May 1940, that Britain will survive. The historical record does not preserve Churchill's exact words at the moment he saw the American troops. Unlike his famous speeches, "We shall fight on the beaches," never in the field of human conflict. Some chicken, some neck. This moment was private. There were no reporters present, no recording devices, no official transcript. We have only John Martin's diary entry, written hours later from memory, and a brief mention in Churchill's own war memoirs, published years afterward. But the absence of a perfect historical record does not diminish the significance of the moment. Sometimes the most important moments in history are the quiet ones, the turning points that happen not in speeches or battles, but in private realizations. Churchill's realization, standing at that window, was simple and profound. Britain was no longer alone. After 30 months of standing against Nazi Germany with only the Commonwealth and limited Soviet cooperation, after 30 months of wondering if invasion would come, if the convoys would get through, if the RAF could hold the skies, the burden was being shared. The Americans marching below were not seasoned troops. They were not yet the battle-hardened veterans who would storm Omaha Beach or fight through the Ardennes. They were, in many ways, amateurs, civilians in uniform, learning as they went. But they were present. And presence, in January 1942, was everything. Churchill's emotional response, the wet eyes, the quiet words to Martin, reflects the enormous psychological weight he had been carrying. Prime ministers are not supposed to show vulnerability. Leaders are not supposed to admit fear. But Churchill, alone among the Allied leaders, had faced the possibility of total defeat. Stalin could trade space for time, retreating into Russia's vast interior. Roosevelt could rely on 2 oceans and the world's largest navy. But Churchill had nowhere to retreat. Britain is an island, and once the Royal Navy was defeated or the RAF was broken, there would be no falling back. The stakes for Churchill were existential, and he had carried that knowledge alone. The arrival of American troops did not eliminate the danger. Britain would continue to face bombing raids, submarine attacks, and the constant strain of total war. But it changed the equation fundamentally. Germany could not defeat Britain, Russia, and America combined. The mathematics simply did not work. Hitler could win battles, but he could not win the war. And that shift from "we might survive" to "we will win" is what Churchill sees in the marching column below his window. In the days following the march, British and American commanders meet to coordinate strategy. General Eisenhower, newly appointed to command U.S. forces in Europe, works closely with British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Alan Brooke. The relationship is not always smooth. Brooke finds Eisenhower inexperienced. Eisenhower finds Brooke overly cautious. But both men understand the necessity of cooperation. This is not like the coalitions of the Napoleonic Wars or even the Great War, where each nation fought under its own command. This will be an integrated command structure, with American and British forces fighting side by side under unified leadership. Churchill watches this process with satisfaction. He has argued for months that the only way to defeat Germany is through combined operations. Britain providing experience and strategic positioning, America providing manpower and industrial might. The alternative, each nation fighting independently, would be catastrophic. The march through London, small as it is, represents the beginning of that integration. It is the first visible sign that the Anglo-American alliance is not just a diplomatic agreement, but a military reality. The American soldiers themselves are still learning what this war means. They have seen newsreels. Yes, they have read headlines about the Blitz and Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. But seeing London's bomb damage firsthand, walking through streets where children still sleep in underground stations every night, talking to British soldiers who have been fighting since 1939. These experiences bring the war into focus in ways that training never could. Private First Class Miller, the Oklahoma soldier who promised to prove America's commitment, writes another letter home in February. "The British people are tired," he writes. "You can see it in their faces. They've been fighting for over 2 years, and they're just tired. But they keep going, and now they're looking at us to help carry the load. I don't know if we're ready, but I know we have to be, because if we're not, they might not make it." Miller's assessment is accurate. Britain's reserves of manpower and material are nearly exhausted. Without American reinforcement, the strategic initiative would pass entirely to Germany. The impact of American entry into the war extends beyond military calculations. It fundamentally alters the political landscape of the conflict. Until December 1941, the war could be framed, and was framed by Nazi propagandists, as a struggle between European powers, with Britain trying to maintain its empire and Germany seeking to unify the continent. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately against Operation Barbarossa, could be portrayed as defending socialism rather than democracy. But with America's entry, the war becomes something different. A truly global conflict between totalitarianism and democracy, with the world's largest democracy now fully committed to the fight. Churchill grasps this shift immediately. In his speeches following Pearl Harbor, he begins to emphasize the ideological nature of the conflict. This is not just about territory or empire. It is about fundamental human freedoms. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in August 1941, becomes the foundation of the Allied cause. Self-determination, freedom of the seas, freedom from fear and want. With American participation, these principles move from aspirational to achievable, but achieving them will require years of brutal combat. The American troops marching through London in January 1942 are just the beginning. They will be followed by millions more. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, support personnel. They will train in Britain, stage from Britain, and fight across North Africa, Italy, and France. Thousands will die on battlefields with unfamiliar names. Thousands more will return home changed by what they witnessed and did. Churchill knows all this. Standing at the window, watching the column pass, he is not thinking about parades or propaganda. He's thinking about the long road ahead, the campaigns yet to be planned, the battles yet to be fought, the casualties yet to be suffered. But he is also thinking about something simpler and more profound. Britain has survived, despite Hitler's predictions, despite the fall of France, despite the Blitz and the U-boats and the string of defeats in Greece and Crete and North Africa. Britain has survived. And with American help, it will do more than survive. It will prevail. The march through London lasts 45 minutes. By 4 p.m., the streets are empty again. The American soldiers disperse to their temporary billets, the Londoners back to their routines. The rain continues, as it always does in London in winter. The war continues, as it has for 30 months. But something has changed. Something intangible but real. Churchill returns to work. There are cables to send, decisions to make, speeches to prepare. The war does not pause for emotional moments or symbolic gestures. But throughout the evening, as he works through the stack of papers on his desk, he finds his mind returning to the image of those American soldiers marching through the rain. 400 men, most of them barely out of their teens, 6,000 miles from home, marching through the capital of an empire that has been fighting alone for 2.5 years. And in that image, Churchill sees the future. Not just the future of the war, but the future of the world. The Anglo-American alliance being forged in these months will outlast the war. It will become the foundation of the post-war order, the special relationship that Churchill will famously describe in his Iron Curtain speech 4 years later. It will shape the reconstruction of Europe, the creation of NATO, the Cold War that follows. But in January 1942, none of that is certain. All that is certain is that Britain is no longer alone. And for Winston Churchill, after 30 months of carrying the burden of Britain's survival on his shoulders, that is enough. The image of Churchill at the window, watching American troops march through London, becomes iconic in retrospect. It represents a turning point, not in the tactical sense, but in the psychological sense. The moment when the tide begins to turn, the moment when survival becomes victory, the moment when the old lion, battered and bloodied but still standing, sees reinforcements arriving and knows that the fight will continue, and that, eventually, it will be won. John Martin's diary entry for January 26, 1942, concludes with a simple observation. The Prime Minister was more at ease tonight than I have seen him in months. The weight seems to have lifted, if only slightly. He knows the road ahead is long, but for the first time, he can see the end of it. That vision, the end of the road, the final victory, is what sustains Churchill through the brutal years ahead, through the disaster at Kasserine Pass and the hard fighting in Italy, through the V-weapon attacks on London and the Battle of the Bulge, through all the setbacks and sacrifices that will come before VE Day in May 1945. But the foundation of that vision is laid here, on this gray January afternoon, when 400 American soldiers marched through London and Winston Churchill, watching from a window on Whitehall, realizes that Britain is no longer standing alone.